For 8 months, a sanitation worker in Detroit had quietly been placing a cup of hot coffee beside an old man sleeping next to dumpster number 7. He didn't know that the crumpled sheets of paper the old man left behind each morning could save the lives of children lying in the hospital just across the street. 4:15 a.m. Detroit was still asleep. Sanitation truck number 0 came to a stop at the beginning of Gratiot Avenue, right at the corner with St. Antoine Street. Roy Maddox turned off the engine but didn't get out right away. He sat still in the cab for another 30 seconds. It was Roy's habit, not to rest, but to listen. To listen to the city in that rare moment when it was still quiet, before the sirens of ambulances, the pounding hammers from demolition sites, and the drunken shouting of men filled the air. Then he opened the door and stepped down. The November cold in Detroit struck his face like a razor blade. Roy zipped his company jacket up to his chin. It was a faded orange reflective jacket, worn by years of use, the left shoulder torn along a long seam and stitched back together by his own hand with black thread. On the left chest, the words Detroit Sanitation Division had almost completely faded. Now only Detroit and half of San remained visible. Roy was 34 years old. He was born on Detroit's east side and grew up in an apartment in Conant Gardens back when the area had not yet completely declined. His mother, Eleanor Maddox, worked night shifts as a nurse at Sinai Grace Hospital for 23 years, until her knees could no longer endure it. She passed away when Roy was 26, leaving him a house still under mortgage, a 2001 Buick LeSabre, and a sentence he would never forget. You don't need to be rich, you just need to never walk past someone lying on the ground without bending down. Roy didn't go to college. He graduated from Denby High School with just enough grades to pass, then got a job with the Detroit Sanitation Department at the age of 20. 14 years. The same route, the same dumpsters, the same grinding, creaking sound of the garbage compactor in the darkness before dawn. Roy's route began at Gratiot Avenue, turning into the area around the Detroit Medical Center, home to 4 major hospitals, including the Children's Hospital of Michigan. His job was to clean up trash along that entire stretch. From closed convenience stores, I passed the abandoned warehouse of an auto parts factory from the days when General Motors was still king, all the way to the fence behind the pediatric emergency unit. Dumpster number 7 stood right at the corner, next to a side entrance of the Children's Hospital. It was a 6-cubic-meter industrial dumpster, its blue paint almost entirely peeled off. On its side was a sticker that read, "No dumping, violators will be fined," though no one paid attention. Roy understood this dumpster better than anyone. He knew what it usually held on which days. Mondays meant pizza boxes still smeared with cheese from the weekend. Wednesdays meant medical gloves from the night shift. Fridays often meant a few empty beer bottles from maintenance workers getting an early start on the weekend. But that morning, at dumpster number 7, there was something Roy had never seen before. A person. More precisely, an old man. He lay curled between 2 pieces of cardboard, pressed close to the base of the dumpster in the most wind-sheltered spot. He wore a charcoal gray overcoat, torn to shreds. One look told Roy it had once been expensive. The kind with a firm collar, sharply tailored shoulders, and buttons made of real horn, not plastic. But now it was so dirty its original color was barely recognizable. His silver-white hair fell past his shoulders, tangled and clumped together. Roy glanced at his hands, long, thin, with slender fingers, not the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime doing manual labor. Roy stopped 3 steps away. In 14 years as a sanitation worker, Roy had seen hundreds of homeless people sleeping beside dumpsters. Detroit was not short of such sights. The city had once had nearly 2 million residents. Now it had fewer than 600,000, and the empty spaces left behind were often filled by lives with nowhere else to go. Roy was used to stepping over them, not because he was heartless, but because he was afraid. Afraid of being stabbed. Afraid of being asked for money and then followed home. Afraid that one day he would bend down and recognize the face lying there. an old friend from Denby, or a former neighbor from Conant Gardens. But this old man was different. He wasn't curled up like a drunk. He didn't scratch and mutter like an addict. He lay neatly, hands folded over his chest, knees slightly bent. The posture of someone accustomed to sleeping in a proper bed, so with pillows and blankets, still holding on to that habit even on cold concrete. And on the ground, right beside his head, there was a piece of paper. Roy didn't pick it up. Not yet. He stood there for a few seconds more, then turned back to the truck. He opened the lunchbox he had prepared the night before. 2 slices of white bread with peanut butter, an apple, and a thermos of coffee. He poured coffee into a plastic cup, placed the cup and 1 slice of bread on the ground about half a meter from the old man's head. Then he walked away to do his job. He didn't wake the man, didn't ask questions, didn't call the police or a homeless support hotline. He just left the food there, as if it were the most natural thing he could do, and continued collecting trash. When he returned the second time, around 5:45, the cup was empty. The slice of bread was gone, and the old man was no longer there. Only the piece of paper remained. Roy bent down and picked it up. It was wrinkled, damp with dew, covered in blue ballpoint ink, written in a shaky but still very clear hand. The handwriting of someone who had once written a lot, very quickly, but whose hand was no longer steady. On the paper was a drawing. Not of a person, not of a house. It was a diagram. Straight lines, arrows, symbols Roy couldn't understand. Beneath it was a line of text. Membrane porosity, 0.3 micron. Neonatal application. Roy didn't know what membrane porosity was. He didn't know what neonatal meant, but he folded the paper and put it into his jacket pocket. Not exactly out of curiosity, but because it looked like something important. Not like the way his mother used to keep every prescription, test result, and doctor's appointment slip in a metal tin under the bed. She once told him, "You never know when you'll need it, but when you do and don't have it, it's already too late." The next morning, at exactly 4:15, Roy stopped again at the head of Gratiot, and the old man was there again. Same spot, same position, same charcoal gray coat. Roy poured coffee again, set down another slice of bread. This time, just as Roy placed the cup down, the old man opened his eyes. Pale eyes, blue-gray, or perhaps once a deeper blue before time washed everything away, looked at Roy without fear, without pleading, without confusion. That gaze seemed to be trying to remember something, a name, a fragment of memory, something both very close and very far. "Coffee?" Roy said, in a normal tone, as if speaking to a co-worker in a break room. "Still hot." The old man blinked, then slowly pushed himself up, took the cup with both hands, and took a small sip. His lips moved. "Thank you," he said. His voice was hoarse from the cold and age, but his pronunciation was still very clear. Not the voice of someone who had lived on the streets too long. It was the voice of someone who had once stood at a podium, given speeches, issued commands in a laboratory, or some place where words carried weight. Roy simply nodded, then turned away. And from that day on, everything became a ritual. Every morning, between 4:15 and 4:20, Roy Maddox stopped his truck at the head of Gratiot Avenue, poured coffee into a plastic cup, took a portion of food from his lunchbox, and placed it beside the man lying next to dumpster number 7. Some days it was peanut butter bread. Some days it was a granola bar. Some days, on paydays, it was a McMuffin he picked up from McDonald's on his way to work. The old man, at first, Roy only thought of him as the dumpster old man, later simply as him. Never asked for anything more. He never asked Roy's name, never said where he came from, never explained why he was there. He just accepted the coffee, ate the food Roy left, and disappeared before daylight fully broke. But every morning he left behind a piece of paper. Roy collected them all. By the end of the second month, he had 37 sheets, all neatly stored in a zippered plastic bag, hidden in the tool compartment of the truck. He didn't read them carefully, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't understand much of it anyway. It was all symbols, diagrams, formulas, and long English words he had never encountered in everyday life. Still, he kept them all, carefully, noting each day. By the third week, Roy began bringing an old blanket. Not a new one. Roy couldn't afford a new blanket. It was a brown fleece blanket with a deer pattern, one his mother used to use while watching TV, bought from Dollar General for $9.99. Roy washed it clean, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the dumpster before the old man arrived. The next morning, the old man was wrapped in that very blanket. And for the first time, he said more than 2 words. "So, who are you?" he asked. "I'm Roy," he replied. "I collect trash." The old man looked at the truck, at Roy's reflective uniform, at his steel-toed boots worn down from years of walking on concrete and asphalt. Then he nodded, as if that answer was enough, completely enough. "I'm Harold," he said. I used to do something, but I don't remember clearly." Roy didn't ask more. He had seen too many people on the streets of Detroit lose everything: homes, jobs, memories, and even the reason to keep living, to understand that sometimes the question, "Where are you from?" could be more cruel than silence. Roy Maddox's life was not comfortable enough for him to freely share with anyone. He earned $19.62 an hour, the base wage of a Detroit sanitation worker after 14 years of service. On the surface, it didn't sound bad, but that was before everything got taken out. Federal taxes, Michigan state taxes, health insurance, retirement contributions, and mandatory union dues for AFSCME Local 207. After all those deductions, Roy took home about $2,300 a month. The rent for his one-bedroom apartment in Banglatown, the name locals used for the area east of Hamtramck, where many Bangladeshi residents lived, already took $1,100. Car expenses, including gas, insurance, and maintenance for his aging Buick LeSabre, added another $300. Food, if Roy was careful, his cooking at home and hunting for discounts at Aldi, came to around $250. Utilities, internet, and phone totaled $200. Then there was the credit card debt from when his mother fell ill. He paid a minimum of $200 each month, barely making a dent because of the 24% interest rate. In the end, he had $200 left. $200 for everything else in his life. Laundry at the laundromat, a haircut at Marcus's shop on Joseph Campau, painkillers for the days when his back ached like it was about to break after a shift, and sometimes, very rarely, a beer at Bumbo's on Canif with Tommy Garcia, the driver of truck number 14. Since Harold appeared, Roy had to tighten things even more, and he stopped buying the Folgers coffee he used to get and switched to Great Value from Walmart, $1.40 cheaper per container. He stopped buying apples because they were more expensive than bananas, so he switched to bananas. He cut lunch entirely 2 days a week, replacing it with water and a few packs of saltine crackers taken for free from the company break room, Tommy Garcia noticed. "You skipping lunch?" Tommy asked one Wednesday afternoon, standing next to Roy in the truck yard. Tommy was Mexican, big-built, with a beer belly pushing against his shirt, and always looked like he was about to tell a joke. "Or are you doing one of those TikTok diets?" "Not hungry," Roy replied. "Liar." Tommy tossed him half a burrito. "Eat. My wife made too much." Roy took it and ate. But he didn't say anything about Harold, not because he was ashamed, but because he himself didn't know how to explain it in a way that made sense. A sanitation worker behind on 2 months of rent, yet every morning bringing coffee and food to a homeless man sleeping beside a dumpster. It sounded like the story of someone who had lost his mind. Or of a saint. Roy was neither. He was just a man who couldn't walk past someone lying on the ground without bending down. By the 4th month, Roy's landlord started calling. He was an Arab man named Nasser Fakouri, who owned 6 apartments in the area. "Roy, it's been 2 months," he said over the phone. "I like you. You're a decent guy. But I've got a mortgage to pay too." "I know, Mr. Fakouri. I'll send it by the end of this month." "You said that last month, too." Roy knew Mr. Fakouri wasn't a bad person. He was just an immigrant trying to hold on to his property in a city where housing prices had collapsed since 2008 and never truly recovered. But understanding that was one thing. Coming up with the money on time was another. So Roy started taking extra shifts. 2 extra shifts a week, mostly cleaning up after events at Huntington Place, the city's largest convention center, sitting along the Detroit River, where you could see Canada across the water. And each extra shift paid $110. 2 shifts meant $220. That was enough to keep him afloat with Mr. Fakouri for a little while longer. But the price was sleep. Roy began sleeping only 4 hours a night. Some nights, not even 3. His body reacted almost immediately. His back ached constantly. His left shoulder, the one he used to lift dumpster lids, swelled every evening. He took ibuprofen so often it became a habit. 4 pills every 6 hours, double the recommended dose on the label. His stomach began to churn. But Roy didn't go to the doctor. Just the insurance copay alone was $40, a number he couldn't afford at the time. But no matter how exhausted he was, every morning at exactly 4:15, Roy still poured coffee for Harold. Harold began speaking more in the 3rd month. Not about his life. Not confessions. Just fragments of sentences, spilling out unexpectedly as if his brain were broadcasting through a broken radio. Sometimes sharp enough to send a chill down the spine. Sometimes distorted. Sometimes just static. Then silence again. The membrane has to be thin enough for oxygen to pass through, but thick enough to block bacteria. Harold said that on a Tuesday morning. He stared into the distance, holding the cup of coffee without drinking. The lungs of a 24-week premature infant are only the size of an apricot. Do you understand? The size of an apricot. Roy didn't understand, but for the first time, he sat down beside him instead of just standing and listening. "I solved it," Harold continued. His voice suddenly sharpened, clear in a way that was almost unsettling, as if the fog in his mind had briefly lifted. "In 2019, I solved the problem of selective permeability, but I can't remember where I wrote it down. I write every day, but the next day I can't remember what I wrote the day before." Then he stopped. The fog returned as quickly as it had lifted. Harold lowered his head, took a sip of coffee, looked up at Roy with eyes that had grown cloudy again, and said in a very ordinary tone, "Thank you. The coffee is good." Roy stood up, brushed the dust off his knees, picked up the sheet of paper Harold had written while it was still dark, and slipped it into the zip bag. By this point, the 4th month, that zip bag was full. Roy had to switch to using an old Nike shoebox he dug out from a pile of old belongings at home. 63 sheets of paper, all labeled by date, all written in Harold's trembling handwriting, and all filled edge to edge with diagrams, formulas, symbols, things Roy could not understand a single word of. He stored the box under his bed, right next to the metal tin containing his mother's medical papers. By the 6th month, Detroit entered true winter. No longer the polite chill of autumn, but the kind of cold typical of the Great Lakes region, where winds from Lake Erie and Lake Huron cut straight through the city with nothing large enough to stop them. At night, temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. During the day, if lucky, they rose to -5. Roy brought Harold a coat, not a new one. It was Roy's own Carhartt winter jacket, a thick canvas coat lined with fleece, earth brown in color, the kind almost every worker in Michigan recognized. Roy had bought it 3 years earlier during a Black Friday sale at Tractor Supply on 8 Mile Road for $140. Aside from his Buick, it was the most expensive item he owned. He handed it to Harold without saying anything. Harold took it without asking anything, and he put on the Carhartt jacket. It hung loosely on his thin frame. Harold was much thinner than Roy, but he buttoned it carefully, one button at a time, from bottom to top, as if it were not something picked up off the street, but something that deserved to be treated properly. "Good coat," he said. "Yeah," Roy replied. From that day on, Roy wore two hoodies layered on top of each other instead. Not warm enough, but enough not to freeze to death. On the night of December 19th, Detroit was hit by the first snowstorm of the season. 22 centimeters of snow fell in 7 hours. Winds gusted up to 70 kilometers per hour. The city declared a weather emergency. Shelters opened all night. Cass Community Social Services on Cass Avenue, NSO Tumaney Center on West Grand Boulevard, Pope Francis Center downtown. Roy called 211, the Michigan Social Services hotline, to ask if anyone was picking up homeless people near the Children's Hospital. "We've sent vans to the hot spots," the operator said, "but if someone refuses to get on, we can't force them." Roy knew Harold would refuse. The old man had never left the area around dumpster number 7. Roy had tried twice to invite him into a nearby fast food place to warm up. Both times, Harold shook his head. He looked toward the Children's Hospital and said the same sentence. "I need to stay here. I'm working." "Working on what?" Roy asked the first time. Harold looked at him. His eyes suddenly lit up for a brief moment, like a flash of lightning. Then he said, "I don't remember what it's called, but it will save the children. Their lungs. Little lungs the size of an apricot." That night of the snowstorm, Roy didn't go home after his shift. He drove his Buick to the head of Gratiot Avenue to find Harold. The old man was curled up in the Carhartt jacket between two pieces of cardboard, a thin layer of snow covering him. Roy stepped out of the car, brushed the snow off him and, for the first time, touched Harold. He placed his hand on the man's forehead. Cold, but still breathing. Roy opened the trunk, took out the emergency foil blanket he always kept in case his car broke down in winter, and wrapped it around Harold. Then he sat down beside him, right in the middle of the snowstorm, leaning against dumpster number 7, and waited until morning. At 4 a.m., the storm began to ease. Harold opened his eyes. He looked at Roy, his face flushed red from the cold, lips cracked, hands trembling, and said a sentence Roy would remember for the rest of his life. "You look like my son," before he became a bastard. Then he fell silent. That morning, Harold wrote 4 pages instead of 1. His hands trembled more than usual, but he kept writing continuously, hunched over, lips moving as if quietly reading to himself. When he finished, he folded the 4 sheets, placed them on Roy's chest — he had fallen asleep from exhaustion — and disappeared. Roy woke up at 6. His neck was stiff. His back hurt so much he could barely stand straight. He picked up the 4 sheets, put them into the shoebox, and drove home. That day, for the first time in 14 years, he called in sick. By the 7th month, something began to change. Harold forgot more. Some mornings he didn't recognize Roy. Some mornings he did, but called him Michael, a name Roy didn't know. Some mornings, Harold sat and cried without making a sound, tears quietly running down the deep lines of his face, repeating one sentence over and over. "I can't remember my wife's face. I can't remember my wife's face." But he still wrote. Every morning, whether he remembered or forgot, whether he was crying or silent, Harold still sat up, pulled a pen from the pocket of the Carhartt jacket. Roy had placed a pen and a stack of paper there since the 5th month, and began to write, as if his hands still remembered what his mind had lost. By the end of the 7th month, Roy had 172 sheets of paper. The shoebox was no longer enough, so he had to switch to a plastic file box he bought at Office Depot for $8.99. Then, on a morning at the beginning of the 8th month, Harold called him by his correct name. "Roy," he said. His voice was clear in a way that was startling. "I am Harold Vance. Dr. Harold Vance. I was the Director of Research at the Biomedical Engineering Institute at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I am the inventor of Vance membrane, a biological filtration membrane used in respiratory support machines for premature infants. 12 hospitals are using it, including that one." He raised his hand and pointed toward the Children's Hospital of Michigan, less than 100 meters away. "But I haven't finished. The current version is only step 1. Version 2, the one I'm rewriting every morning, could reduce mortality in premature infants under 26 weeks from 30% to under 10. Roy stood frozen, on the cup of coffee still in his hand, feeling as if the ground beneath his feet had tilted. "You," he began, but stopped. "I have early-stage dementia," Harold said. His voice was calm, as if he were reading the test results of a complete stranger. "I was diagnosed 3 years ago. My family, my son Michael and his wife, put me into Sunrise Nursing Home in Bloomfield Hills. Then they took control of the patent. All of it. Michael said I no longer had legal capacity. He took it to court. And he won. Then he sold the licensing rights to Vance membrane to Medtronic Systems for $14 million. Harold fell silent for a moment. Then he continued, his voice softer, as if this was a sentence he had told himself so many times, it no longer carried anything but bare truth. "I don't care about the money. I care about version 2. And Michael doesn't want version 2 to exist, because if version 2 appears, the original patent will change, and he'll have to renegotiate the entire contract. He wants everything to stay the same. He wants me to sit in that nursing home and slowly die." "So you ran away?" Roy asked. Harold looked at him. "I didn't run," he said. "I walked out one morning. The Sunrise Nursing Home leaves its doors open during the day, and then I forgot how to get back. I just kept walking, until I saw the Children's Hospital, and I stopped here. For some reason, I can't even explain. I knew I needed to be here." Roy swallowed. You say you invented that membrane, and for months now, you've been writing page after page every morning. So I'm rewriting version 2, Harold said, from memory, every morning. While it's still dark and my mind is clear enough, I rewrite what I can still remember. By noon, I forget almost everything. The next day, I write again, and again, like a machine that's broken but refuses to stop running. He looked at the cup of coffee in Roy's hand. "And you're the only one who's been keeping what I write." Roy Maddox couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his bed in his one-bedroom apartment in Banglatown, staring at the ceiling, the same water stain with its strange shape that he had memorized from looking at it so many times. And thought. Under the bed was the plastic file box containing 172 handwritten sheets from a man whom, until that morning, he had believed was just a homeless old man who had lost his mind. Now he knew the man was Dr. Harold Vance. Roy picked up his phone, the Samsung Galaxy A13 he was paying off at $12 a month, and typed, "Harold Vance membrane." Google returned results almost instantly. Not just a few, dozens. There were articles on Nature Biomedical Engineering, an interview on NPR, a feature on the official website of the University of Michigan. And there was also a photograph, Harold Vance standing at a podium at a medical conference in Chicago, wearing a gray suit, his silver hair neatly trimmed, gold-rimmed glasses on, smiling with the calm confidence of someone who knew he was changing the world. Roy stared at that photo. Then he turned his head toward the window, in the direction of Gratiot Avenue, where, at that very moment, that same man was lying on freezing concrete beside dumpster number 7. He kept reading. Vance membrane was a nanostructured biological filtration membrane designed to be installed in respiratory support machines for premature infants. It allowed oxygen to pass through while blocking bacteria and inflammatory particles giving the fragile lungs of preterm babies more time to develop without infection. So 12 hospitals across the United States had implemented this technology, including the Children's Hospital of Michigan. In those hospitals, survival rates for infants born under 28 weeks of gestation had increased by 22%. And Harold had said version 2 could do even more. It could reduce mortality for infants born under 26 weeks, the highest risk group, to below 10%. Roy typed again, Harold Vance, missing. Nothing. Not a single missing person report. No alert. No one seemed to be looking for him. He tried again. Harold Vance family. This time he found an article in the business section of the Detroit Free Press, published 18 months earlier. The headline stated that Michael Vance, son of inventor Harold Vance, had been appointed by the Oakland County Court as the legal guardian and manager of his father's intellectual property, who was currently under care at a long-term facility after being diagnosed with dementia. The article included a photo of Michael Vance, about 45 years old, black hair neatly styled, wearing a dark suit, standing in front of the Medtronic Systems building in Troy, Michigan, shaking hands with the company's CEO. The caption beneath the image read, $14 million Vance membrane licensing agreement. Roy stared at Michael Vance's face on the screen for a long time. Then he remembered what Harold had said during the snowstorm. You look like my son, before he became a bastard. Roy turned off the phone. He lay down, closed his eyes, then opened them again. He sat up, leaned down, and pulled the file box out from under the bed. He needed to help Harold. But who was he? Just a sanitation worker. No degree. No money. No lawyer. No connections in the medical field. No connections in law. But he had 172 sheets of paper. The next morning, Roy didn't arrive at dumpster number 7 at 4:15 like usual. He came at 3:45, while Harold was still asleep. He placed the coffee and bread in the usual spot, then sat waiting in the dark. When Harold opened his eyes, and fortunately, that was a good day, he recognized Roy immediately. Roy spoke. Mr. Vance, I know who you are now. I looked you up online. Harold was silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded slowly. I have all the papers you wrote, Roy continued. 172 sheets. I kept all of them. I sorted them by date. I don't understand what's written on them, but I think they're important. Harold looked at him, and in that moment, his eyes lit up. Not the vague flicker of memory coming and going, but complete clarity. Sharp, almost blazing. See, like a light switched on in the final second before a fuse burns out. More important than you think, he said. If arranged correctly, they form the complete design of version 2. I write a part each day. The next day I forget. But what's written remains on paper. I've repeated that process for 8 months. And you, he paused, you're the only one who's kept all of it. Roy felt a weight settle in his chest. Who do I take these papers to? He asked. Children's Hospital of Michigan, Harold answered immediately, without hesitation. Neonatal Department. Find Dr. Priya Nadkarni. She's the head of neonatal intensive care. She knows me. She knows version 1. She'll understand version 2. And your son? Harold's face hardened. Michael won't want you to do this, he said. He'll say I'm crazy. He'll say those papers mean nothing. Then he'll threaten to sue you. But Roy... Harold reached out and grabbed Roy's hand. His hand was thin, cold, but his grip was firm. Don't listen to him. Listen to me. I'm clear right now. At this moment, I'm clear. Roy nodded. Roy Maddox had never entered the Children's Hospital of Michigan through the front door. Up until now, he had only known the hospital from the back, from the dumpsters, the employee parking lot, and the supply entrance where trucks carrying clean linens and medical waste bins moved in and out constantly. He knew the smell of the hospital through what was thrown away. The smell of chlorine, plastic, and something faintly sweet and unsettling that he had never wanted to think about too deeply. But the main lobby was a completely different world. The tiled floor shone so brightly it reflected the overhead lights. The walls were decorated with paintings of dinosaurs and astronauts to comfort children. In one corner of the lobby stood a Christmas tree nearly 3 meters tall, even though the holiday season had long passed, but well into January, the lights still blinking steadily, as if time inside this hospital did not move in the usual way. Nurses in white uniforms walked back and forth. Doctors in blue scrubs hurried through the corridors. On the waiting benches, parents with red, tear-filled eyes sat holding each other in silence. Roy stood in front of the reception desk, clutching the plastic file box tightly against his chest. He wore the cleanest pair of jeans he had, and the plaid shirt he only wore to church, exactly 3 times a year: Easter, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. "I'd like to see Dr. Priya Nadkarni," he said. The receptionist, a woman in her 20s with a ponytail, a name tag reading Keisha pinned to her chest, looked him up and down. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No. Dr. Nadkarni is the head of the department, but you can't see her without an appointment." "I know," Roy said, "but I have this." He placed the file box on the counter. "You just need to tell her this is the design for version 2 of Vance Membrane, written by Dr. Harold Vance." Keisha looked at the box, then at Roy, then back at the box. You just said Dr. Harold Vance?" "Yes. He's been missing for almost a year. The family said he was transferred to another facility." "He's not missing," Roy said. "He's been sleeping next to a dumpster behind this hospital for 8 months. Keisha didn't say anything else. She picked up the phone. Dr. Priya Nadkarni was 52 years old. She was born in Mumbai, raised in Edison, New Jersey, studied medicine at Johns Hopkins, trained in neonatal intensive care at UCSF, and was one of the very few doctors in the world who truly understood how Vance membrane worked at its deepest level. Over the past 2 years, she had used it to save 63 premature infants at the Children's Hospital of Michigan. She appeared in the lobby 12 minutes after Keisha's call. She wore a white lab coat, a stethoscope around her neck, her black hair neatly clipped back. Her dark brown eyes looked at Roy with a highly professional skepticism, the kind that comes from being used to wild claims, to strangers appearing and insisting they hold something impossible. "Who are you?" she asked. "Roy Maddox. I'm a sanitation worker, and I clean trash around this area. And you're saying you have the design for version 2 of Vance membrane?" "I didn't even know what it was until last week," Roy replied. "I just know there's an old man named Harold who writes pages every morning, and I've been picking them up and keeping them." Roy opened the box. 172 sheets lay inside, arranged by date, each bundle clipped together with small clips he had bought from Dollar Tree. Dr. Nadkarni leaned down and picked up the first sheet. She read, and Roy saw her face change. Not gradually. Instantly. As if someone had flipped a switch in her mind. The skepticism in her eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly. She set the first sheet down, picked up the second, then the third, then the 10th. Her hands began to tremble. "Oh my God," she whispered in English, and then she muttered something in Hindi that Roy didn't understand. She looked back up and spoke again, faster now. "This is Harold's handwriting. I recognize it. And this," she pointed at a diagram, "this is the nanostructure he discussed with me 2 years ago, before they took him away. He said he would solve the selective permeability problem. And this," she flipped to another sheet, scanning rapidly. "He solved it." She looked up at Roy, and for the first time in his life, Roy saw tears in a doctor's eyes. "Where is he?" she asked. "Dumpster number 7, Roy replied, "right by the rear service entrance." Dr. Nadkarni didn't call the police. She didn't call hospital administration. She definitely didn't call a lawyer. She only called 2 people, The first was Dr. Benjamin Chu, the deputy head of neonatal intensive care. The second was Margaret Walsh, the director of nursing. They were the only two people she trusted completely. 30 minutes later, 4 people, Roy, Nadkarni, Chu, and Walsh, stood behind the hospital next to dumpster number 7. Harold was still there. He was wearing Roy's Carhartt jacket, wrapped in the brown fleece blanket with the deer pattern. The leather shoes on his feet were nearly worn through. The socks visible at his ankles were torn into thin strips. "Harold," Dr. Nadkarni knelt down, her voice softening, gentling, the same way she spoke to the parents of infants in the neonatal intensive care unit. "Harold, it's Priya Nadkarni. Do you remember me?" Harold opened his eyes. It was not a good day. His gaze was cloudy, unfocused, not settling on anyone long enough to truly recognize them. He looked at Nadkarni, at Chu, at Walsh. Then he turned to Roy, and when he saw Roy, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly into a faint smile. "Coffee," he said. Roy opened the thermos and poured coffee into the cup. Harold took it and drank. And as he drank, Dr. Nadkarni began to cry. Not loudly, but the quiet kind of crying from someone who had been strong for too long. What happened next unfolded fast and violently, like a second storm hitting Detroit before the first had even cleared. Dr. Nadkarni brought Harold into the hospital that very day, not as a psychiatric patient, but as a visiting medical collaborator under a special provision for research consultants. That was the legal phrasing for a very simple reality. She gave him a clean bed, 3 proper meals a day, and the protection of an entire healthcare system against anyone who might try to take him away. The next step was the design. Dr. Nadkarni and Dr. Chu spent 3 full weeks organizing, decoding, and verifying the 172 handwritten pages. Then they brought in Dr. James Okafor, a nanomaterials expert from Wayne State University, located less than 2 miles from the hospital, along with Chief Engineer Sandra Watson from the University of Michigan's Biomedical Engineering Lab in Ann Arbor. 3 weeks later, they reached a conclusion. Roy wasn't invited into the meeting where it was announced, but later he was told Nadkarni's exact words. "This is a complete design, version 2 of Vance membrane. If everything on paper is correct, and computer simulations indicate that it is, then we are holding a technology that could reduce neonatal mortality in the highest risk group to a level that, 20 years ago, no one would have dared imagine." Michael Vance learned about it within a week. He flew from Scottsdale back to Detroit, where he had relocated after selling the Vance membrane license and purchasing a $4 million home in Desert Mountain, accompanied by his personal attorney, a man named Bradley Harmon from Dickinson Wright, one of Michigan's largest law firms. Michael Vance was 46, tall, lean, with sharp features resembling his father's, but without the faint warmth Harold still carried in his rare moments of clarity. Michael wore a Brioni suit, Ferragamo shoes, and carried a court order, signed by an Oakland County judge, granting him full authority over Harold Vance's residence and intellectual property. "My father is legally incapacitated," Michael said in a meeting with the hospital board. "I am his legal guardian. Anything he writes, by law, falls under my management. I demand that the hospital surrender all materials and transfer my father to a facility of my choosing." Bradley Harmon immediately followed, speaking in the tone of a man who billed $700 an hour. Furthermore, the hospital's acceptance of Dr. Vance without the consent of his legal guardian constitutes a serious violation. We are prepared to escalate this matter to the State Medical Board. Dr. Nadkarni sat across from Michael Vance without flinching. "First," she said, her voice calm to the point of cold, "your father is not being held here against his will. He came voluntarily. Second, your father was left on the streets of Detroit for 8 months while you were in Scottsdale. If there is a breach of guardianship duty here, it is not on the hospital. Oh, and third," she opened a file on her computer, "I have contacted Adult Protective Services under the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. They have formally opened an investigation into your neglect of your father while he was under your legal guardianship. Roy wasn't in that room, but when he later heard the story, he told Tommy he could almost picture Michael Vance going pale. As for the design, Nadkarni continued, it was written by an individual in a state of freedom, not within a care facility, not under medical supervision, on paper provided by an independent party, and collected by a citizen with no contractual obligation to you. The intellectual property rights of version 2 are not something you can simply claim at will. That will be decided in court. Bradley Harmon opened his mouth to respond. Nadkarni cut him off immediately. And you should also know, she said, that this hospital, the University of Michigan, Wayne State University, and the American Neonatal Medical Association are jointly filing a petition in federal court to review your guardianship over your father's intellectual property. Based on evidence that you have used that guardianship for personal financial gain while deliberately obstructing your father from continuing research that could save children's lives. The room fell silent. Michael Vance looked at Nadkarni, at his lawyer. Around the room, faces from hospital leadership, in-house counsel, media representatives, and understood that this was no longer a battle that money and skilled attorneys could easily suppress. He stood up and walked out without another word. The legal battle lasted 6 months, not because the case was legally complex, but because Michael Vance poured money into delaying it. His legal team continuously filed appeals, requested postponements, challenged federal jurisdiction, and demanded independent psychiatric evaluations for Harold. Each tactic bought more time. Each month of delay meant another month that critically premature infants could not benefit from version 2. But Nadkarni did not back down. She rallied the entire medical community. Detroit Free Press and Michigan Radio began covering the story. NPR aired a national segment. The hashtag Justice for Dr. Vance trended on social media for 3 consecutive days. And there was one detail the media focused on more than anything else. Roy Maddox, a sanitation worker earning $19.62 an hour, behind on 2 months of rent, skipping lunch just to bring coffee to an old man by a dumpster for 8 months. A man with no college degree, yet enough instinct to keep 172 sheets of paper that almost anyone else would have thrown away. A man who didn't know what neonatal meant, but still understood that what a person writes every morning before dawn is never meaningless. Roy hated the attention. He refused television interviews, declined podcast invitations. When a reporter from the Detroit News came to his apartment in Banglatown, Roy cracked the door open and said through the gap, "I just collect trash. I don't have anything to say." But Tommy Garcia, co-worker, drinking buddy, and at some point self-appointed unofficial spokesperson for Roy, spoke on his behalf. "Ooh, Roy's the kindest guy I've ever known," Tommy said on Michigan radio. "And if you've lived in Detroit long enough, you understand something. Kindness in this city isn't a game. It's a survival strategy." In July, the federal court delivered its ruling. Guardianship over Harold Vance's intellectual property was removed from Michael Vance and transferred to a court-appointed management board, including representatives from the University of Michigan, the Children's Hospital of Michigan, and a lawyer specializing in disability rights. Michael Vance was ordered to return part of the royalties he had received, $4,200,000, into a trust dedicated to developing version 2. He did not appeal. He returned to Scottsdale, and from that point on, he never contacted Harold again. Version 2 of Vance Membrane, officially named Vance Membrane Gen 2, was developed over the next 18 months at a joint laboratory between the Children's Hospital of Michigan and the University of Michigan. Dr. Nadkarni led the clinical team. Dr. Okafor and engineer Sandra Watson headed the materials team. And Harold Vance still participated, on the days he remained lucid enough. Some days he sat quietly in the lab, watching the research team work around him, smiling with a deep, quiet satisfaction without saying a word. Other days he didn't remember where he was, didn't understand why he was there, and would simply turn to Roy, who was now allowed to visit any time, and ask if there was coffee today. There always was. The new laboratory was inaugurated in November, exactly 2 years after the morning Roy Maddox first saw an old man lying beside dumpster number 7. It was located on the 3rd floor of the Children's Hospital of Michigan, spanning 240 square meters, equipped with the most advanced facilities in the Midwest for neonatal biomaterials research. Funding came from the Vance Trust, federal NIH grants, and a public fundraising campaign that raised $2,300,000, mostly small donations, $10, $20, $50, from thousands of people who had read Roy and Harold's story online. The official name of the lab was the Roy Maddox Neonatal Biomaterials Research Laboratory. Roy learned about it through a phone call from Dr. Nadkarni. At that moment, he was still driving his garbage truck on Gratiot Avenue, still on the same old route. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Roy asked, pulling the truck to the side of the road. "The lab is named after you, Roy." On his end of the line, everything went quiet for a few seconds. Only the steady rumble of the truck engine remained, the sound of Detroit wind slipping through the door. "I'm a sanitation worker," Roy said finally. "I don't have any degrees." "You have something many people with degrees don't," Nadkarni replied. "You saw a person where everyone else only saw a homeless man." Roy didn't say anything else. He sat in the cab of his truck, looking through the windshield toward the Children's Hospital, the building he had only ever known from the smell of dumpsters behind it. And for the first time in his life, he cried right there at work. 300 people attended the inauguration. The governor of Michigan sent a congratulatory video. The president of the University of Michigan gave a speech. Dr. Nadkarni stood at the podium and recounted the entire story, from dumpster number 7 to the 3rd floor laboratory, and had to pause twice as her voice broke. Harold Vance sat in the front row, in a wheelchair. It was an average day. He recognized Nadkarni, but no longer remembered the name of his own invention. He wore a new suit, his first in over 2 years, but underneath it was still Roy's brown Carhartt jacket. He refused to take it off. Roy stood in the corner of the room, wearing the same plaid shirt he used for church, holding a cup of orange juice simply because he didn't know what else to do with his hands, doing his best not to look at the brass plaque on the wall engraved with his name. Tommy Garcia stood beside him. Tommy was also holding a cup of orange juice. His eyes were red from crying. Tommy Garcia, the big Mexican guy who drove truck number 14, crying openly in front of 300 people without the slightest bit of embarrassment. "You see?" Tommy said, tears running down his face. "I told you. Kindness isn't a game." 1 year after the inauguration, 4:15 a.m. Detroit was still asleep. Roy Maddox parked his truck at the head of Gratiot Avenue. He turned off the engine, then sat still in the cab for another 30 seconds, listening to the city in that rare silence before a new day began. That habit had not changed. Then he stepped out. The November air cut across his face like a thin blade. Roy was wearing a new Carhartt jacket, a gift from Dr. Nadkarni for the opening of the laboratory. Still the familiar earth-brown color. Still the same style of jacket. The only difference was that this one had no tears yet, had not faded yet, had not yet taken on the marks of many winters spent out on the streets of Detroit. He walked along his familiar route. Dumpster number 1, number 2, number 3. The garbage compactor growled in the early morning, and the smell of chlorine, the smell of plastic. Detroit's very own smell. The kind Roy had lived with long enough that it no longer bothered him, only felt familiar. When he reached dumpster number 7, he stopped. No one was there. Now Harold Vance lived in a private room in the hospital's long-term care wing, not a nursing home, but part of the larger research complex, where he could continue writing in the early mornings while his mind was still clear enough and be properly cared for whenever the fog in his memory returned. Version 2 had been submitted to the FDA for licensing review, a process that could take 2 to 3 years, but 3 hospitals had already requested emergency authorization for special cases. The first child saved by Vance membrane Gen 2 was a baby girl born prematurely at 23 weeks, weighing 520 grams, right there at the Children's Hospital of Michigan. Her name was Zara. Her parents were a Somali couple living in southwest Detroit. They had no idea who Roy was until a nurse told them the story. Then they came looking for him all the way to his garbage truck, and the mother, a 28-year-old woman wearing a purple headscarf, took Roy's hand, looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, and said in halting English, "Thank you. You saved my baby." Roy did not know how to answer. He had never known what to say in moments like that. In the end, he only nodded, just as he had once nodded to Harold every morning, just as he had once nodded to his mother, on the days she told him never to step over someone lying on the ground. 4:15 a.m. Dumpster number 7 was still empty. Roy opened the thermos and poured coffee into a plastic cup. He took a small sip. Then he bent down and set the cup on the ground, right where Harold had once lain for so many months. Not to give it to anyone, just a habit. Then he turned, climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and continued his work, collecting trash. In the distance, Detroit was beginning to wake. Perhaps most things that change the world do not begin in large boardrooms, nor with glamorous speeches or million-dollar contracts. Sometimes they begin with a cup of hot coffee placed beside someone the whole city has stopped seeing. Sometimes what saves a life is not genius, but kindness steady enough to be repeated every day, even when no one applauds, no one says thank you, and there is no guarantee that what you are doing will lead to anything at all. Roy Maddox did not think of himself as a hero. He was just a man who remembered what his mother told him. And perhaps, in a city like Detroit, as Tommy Garcia once said, kindness was never a game. It was how people kept each other alive. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, leave a subscription to the channel so you won't miss the next stories. Stories about kindness, patience, and people who seem ordinary but end up doing the unimaginable. And before you go, let me know in the comments. If it were you, on that first morning when you saw Harold lying beside dumpster number 7, would you stop?